Well, now we are a part of session 2 of our Old Testament survey, and so this is the patriarchs. And the patriarchs, again, this is a word meaning the fathers. And so we will talk about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and this will be the content here. And so as we begin to see again, the patriarchs, like I said in the end of our session 1, is that God is going to restore the world through a family. And that particular family is going to come through Abram. And so these fathers, these men will become the fathers of the nation of Israel. Now, I think it's important to underscore that these people are not perfect by any sense of the word. They are far from it. And what we're seeing within it, though, is even though the patriarchal period is messy and is fraught with examples of what not to do, God is clearly at work. And it also shows us God's grace and His patience with His children. So to begin our time, I think it's very important to deal with God's covenant with Abram, because that's what kicks off Genesis chapter 12. And so in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, God promises Abraham 3 things. He promises him land, children, and blessing. And so the first is land, that Abram and his descendants will have land in this place where God sends them. You have to understand, for God to come to Abram, He sat there and said, look, I want you to leave your family. I want you to leave your friends, everything you know. Take your wife, take your servants, take your property, and go. Well, where are we going, God? Well, I'll tell you whenever we get there. And so that took a lot of faith on Abram's part to go to this place that he did not know existed. And God said, wherever that place is, I'm going to give you land there. The second part of the promise was seed or children, and that Abram would be the father of a great nation. The reason this was a big deal, you might be aware, Abram and Sarah were childless. Here they are, 60 and 70 years old, respectfully, Abram being 70, and God sits here and says, I'm going to build a nation through you. And so again, that's going to be another step of faith for Abram. And then finally, the third promise is blessing. God says, Abram, I will bless you, but you will also be a blessing to others. So I'm going to grow you, I'm going to do amazing things for you, but other people are going to be blessed through you. And so these are the 3 promises of what is known as the Abrahamic covenant. God's covenant with Abraham is land, children, and blessing. And so Abram obeys and does what God asks in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, because Abraham leaves. Abram goes to where God says he needs to do. And you know what? I don't know about you, but that would be really hard for me in the sense that I like to have a plan. I didn't used to be a planner, but I became one after many things fell through. And I learned I need to be prepared. And so I like to know where I'm going. And I remember too when I used to do conditioning back, whether I was in high school or college with athletics, I'll run. Just tell me how much I have to run. I hate it when a coach would look at me and say, well, how much do we have to run? Until we're finished. Oh, it's nice knowing, even mentally how far you have to go. Abram didn't get that. Abraham was told, just go. And though as I began to think on it longer and longer, I think that was also a lot of grace to Abram. Because I think as you'll see with his story, if God had told him all the things he was going to go through, I think Abram would have said, no, too much. But he's faithful for the next step. And that's what God calls us to be. Don't try to figure out where you're going to be 10, 20 steps down the road. Trust me for the next step. And then after that, the next one. And so now let's look at God's covenant with Abram. This covenant, incidentally, is repeated not just in Genesis 12. It's not the only time. It also shows up in Genesis 15, 1 to 6, in Genesis 17, 1 to 27, and in Genesis 18:10. And again, in this, God promises to give him land, seed, and blessing. And incidentally, each one of these comes after a moment of crisis. It comes after a time when the covenant might be jeopardized or when there might be doubt regarding the covenant. Now, this is another point that's important to underscore, is the idea of unconditional versus conditional covenants. You might encounter people that say, nope, it was an unconditional covenant. God did it completely on himself. Abram didn't have anything to do with it. That's just not true. It was conditional. Yes, God said, Abram, I'm going to give you land, children, and blessing. But Abram has to obey. That's the condition. Abraham's condition is obedience. And the reality is, in the ancient Near East, you're going to see this acronym ANE. You're going to see this many times through these sessions. That's a short way of writing ancient Near East so we can save space. Is in the ancient Near East, there were always conditions to a covenant. And Abram's condition was to obey. Because without obedience, the covenant doesn't happen. And so as a result, both parties are required to hold to the covenant. Both have to hold their agreement, or else it doesn't work. You're going to see this show up in Genesis chapter 17, verse 9, where it says, as for you, okay, this is God talking, you must keep the covenantal requirement I am imposing upon you. Abram, you need to go and be intimate with Sarah. That's part of it. So he not only has to pick up and leave and go to this land, he has to be intimate with his wife. He has to have sex. Because if he doesn't, there's not going to be a kid. That's him following through. That is obedience. These things have to happen. Abram has to go. Him and Sarai have to go so that God can provide this covenant. He can follow through. So there's also some more things with God's covenant with Abram. God reassures Abram that he will provide what he has promised. There's going to be times when Abram says, you know what, God, this isn't happening. At one point, Abram offers Eliezer. And God says, nope, not going to do it. And this shows up, incidentally, in Genesis chapter 15. This is a powerful chapter. Because God, he sits there, and Abram is sitting in his tent, and he's like, God, are you really going to do this? I'll give you Eliezer. God's like, no. And he says, Abram, I want you to go outside. And he takes him outside and he makes him look up at the stars. And he sees all the stars in the sky. He says, Abram, as many stars are in the sky, that is how many children I'm going to give to you. He wanted to show him the greatness of his plan. There's one scholar that has noted that Abram, when he was laying in the tent, could only see, his vision was as high as the tent. And that God takes him outside to show him the heavens, to show him God's perspective. In other words, that we see things short-sightedly. But Abram had to see the greatness of what God could do. And I tell you, I live in New Zealand in the southern hemisphere, and I was in a place called Doubtful Sound, and it is so dark there. And it was amazing, all the stars you could see. It just blows your mind because, again, there's no light pollution or none of that. And during this passage, incidentally, in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, you may recall it from session 1 when I mentioned this, Abraham looks up and he believes that God is going to follow through on this promise that he's given to him. And God credits that faith as righteousness, as perfection. Okay? And this is a very important verse. It's one of the most important verses in Scripture. It's one that you need to know because it shows that Old Testament folks, that Abram was saved by faith. He had faith in the promises of God. Just as Noah had faith that God would send a flood, Abram had faith that God would give him children, that he would fulfill this promise, this thing that just didn't seem possible. And so faith is what saves, regardless of whether you're in the Old Testament or the New Testament. And it demonstrates the consistency of God's revelation. But within that, Abram then had to have the conviction to act upon that faith. Because again, I believe, and he's given perfection. But now Abram has to follow through. Now, there are other signs of the covenant where God reaffirms his covenant to Abram when he's 99 years old. God repeats the promise of land, seed, and blessing. And he changes his name at this point to Abraham, which is a Hebrew word play on Av Hamon, which means father of nations. So God is sitting here and saying, look, you know what, I'm even going to change your name. You're going to be the father of nations. And Sarai's name is going to be changed to Sarah. Sarah meaning princess. And in chapter 17, verses 9 to 10, there's other signs of the covenant, where God, the call for Abraham to keep the covenant. And so he's going to be circumcised. And the circumcision is going to be a visible sign of the covenant. Okay, now look, as we look at this, we're like, hold on, circumcision? That's the sign of the covenant. And as you can imagine, rabbis, scholars have wrestled over this. Why circumcision? And it seems to be, again, that the reason is it is through the male member that the seed will pass on. And so God is declaring that His. And so incidentally, even Ishmael, a child that God didn't want Abraham to have, even Ishmael and Abraham's servants are circumcised. And so this becomes a sign for the children of Israel that shows that they are God. In fact, it's such an important sign that in Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 to 26, we see an illustration of the severity of not keeping the covenant. In a nutshell, what happens is that Moses, God has told Moses, hey, I want you to go and get my people out of Egypt. And Moses sits there and he's like, all right, yep. He finally acquiesces and says, I'll go. But he doesn't do the circumcision for his sons. And we see that God is moving to kill Moses. It's a really interesting text. It's one that scholars, of course, have wrestled over. And God moves to kill Moses. But his wife Zipporah intervenes and circumcises their two sons. And she takes, it's graphic. She takes their bloody foreskins and she throws them at his feet. And she says, you are a bridegroom of blood to me. In other words, if I wouldn't have intervened right here and circumcised our sons, which you should have done, God would have killed you. Because God is wanting Moses to see, hey, you are my leader. You need to keep my covenant. And that includes doing this covenantal sign. So it's a big deal. And it's, again, anytime someone becomes part of the nation of Israel, they're to be circumcised. On the 8th day of when a male child is born, they're to be circumcised. This is part of the deal. And it's a reminder of God's covenant with Abraham. Now, finally, that covenant happens. And we see that laughter arrives. Now, why did I use the word laughter? Well, I'm going to explain here in just a second. Because God reaffirms His promise of a child in Genesis 18, verse 10. Okay? But when He does this, He's met by laughter by Abraham and Sarah. Because at this point, he's basically 99 years old. And God has said, a year from now, you're going to give birth to a kid. And Abraham, he laughs. In his head, he laughs. And he thinks, I'm just too old. Sarah's in the tent. She overhears this. And she laughs. And she says, there's no more eggs in the basket. Incidentally, the Hebrew text makes that clear. She is postmenopausal. There's no eggs in the basket. She's like, how am I going to receive this pleasure? And incidentally, God points that out to him. They're like, no, we didn't laugh. And he's like, oh no, you did. You did. And that's why the child is named Isaac, because Isaac meaning he laughs. So think about this too, is that every time that they would call their son, every time they would call his name, it would be a reminder that they doubted. You didn't think I could do this. And so it sees too that the son, Isaac, brings joy to his parents. He brings laughter. And incidentally, they're not just going to have to trust him for the child. They're going to have to trust him for the energy to raise a child. If you've ever been around children, they take energy. And so the promise isn't just fulfilled then. It's actually going to keep going beyond that. But even after God tells this to Abraham, he still messes up. In Genesis chapter 20, he jeopardizes the promise because he's visiting Abimelech. He's worried that Abimelech's going to kill him. And so what does he do? He's like, yeah, she's my sister. Because his thought is, they won't kill me. Incidentally, he did this earlier with Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 12 for fear of the same thing. Incidentally, some scholars are going to say, no, this couldn't have happened, let alone happened twice. Because, who'd be dumb enough to do this twice? That's honestly what it comes down to. Are you kidding? We do dumb stuff all the time and repeat that dumb stuff quite often. And that's exactly what Abraham did. And so God has to intervene, and he rescues Sarah. He actually comes to Abimelech in a dream at night and says, hands off. And Abimelech's like, I never put my hand on her. And God's like, I know, but leave her be. And so Abraham jeopardizes this promise, and so God has to intervene to make sure this happens. And so finally, Isaac, or laughter, is born. And so this signals the fulfillment of the promise and Abraham's faithfulness and Sarah's faithfulness. And incidentally, I think it's important to underscore, Abraham is 100 and Sarah is 90. Again, well past the age. Whenever they try to do it another way through Ishmael, again, here he is, he's 85, they haven't had a kid yet. And Sarah sits here and goes, well, tell you what, why don't you sleep with my servant Hagar? We'll see if we can get a son that way. And it works. And Hagar gets pregnant. So Abraham's plumbing works. And Ishmael's the result, okay? But that's not the child that God wanted. And God makes it clear, no, Abraham, it's got to be through you that this comes. And incidentally, within that, I think too, that's why God waited another 15 years. He wanted to make it clear to Abraham, there's no way this child should happen. There's absolutely no way that this should come about. Isaac's birth is going to bring about a final confrontation with Ishmael, where Ishmael is going to have to be let go. And so God is going to say, you know what? Isaac's the one. He's the child of promise. And I'm going to touch on it here in a little bit. But again, Ishmael in some ways is the firstborn. He's Abraham's oldest son. Isaac is the second, though his firstborn was Sarah. But God's like, I'm going to choose the younger, not the older. And that's going to be another way that God flips the societal norms on its ear. But within the story of Isaac, it's important to talk about the sacrifice of Isaac. Because within this, so not only has Isaac been a child that they have waited for, and they have waited for so long, which, by the way, do you think of God when his first interactions with Abraham had said, you're going to have to wait. You're going to have to wait 30 years before you get this kid. I don't think Abraham and Sarah, they went, I don't think so. All right? And so we see that Abraham had the faith, God in his wisdom of revealing things. And so now the child is here, and he's given them the energy to raise the child. But now God comes to Abraham and says, I want you to sacrifice Isaac. I want you to take him to where I'm going to this mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. And in the text, it doesn't say Abraham debated. It says when he got up the next morning, he packs up and they leave. And they head to Moriah. And so incidentally, we read this in our current context, and we're like, this is horrible. What kind of God would ask a child, how does Abraham even go? Well, though unexpected, it's important to note that child sacrifice was not uncommon in the ancient Near East. In fact, whenever we get into latter aspects of the Old Testament, the Jews or the Israelites are going to do child sacrifice themselves. Some of the gods like Molech are going to require child sacrifice. And we're going to read in texts where they pass their children through the fire. So child sacrifice, which is a way of saying child sacrifice, it wasn't uncommon. So it was unexpected. This wasn't what Abraham expected to hear, but it wouldn't have been foreign to him in light of some of the other religions of the time. And so Abraham, though, is like, what do I do? But he acts and he goes and he says, you know what? We're going to go to the mountain. And they reach the mountain after a 3-day journey. And all the while, he's looking for God to intervene. He's wondering what's going to happen. Think about that. 3 days. You're having to walk for 3 days, and all the while it's churning. You know what's going to happen. They get to the base of Mount Moriah. And he says, all right, servants, you stay here. Isaac and I are going up. Isaac, you carry the wood. And they head up. And Isaac's like, hey, Dad, we got wood and we got fire, but where's the sacrifice? And if you recall, Abraham says, God will provide. God is going to provide. And that's honestly what Abraham believed. He's like, I don't know how God's going to show up right now, but He's going to show up. He's going to do something. Again, the writer of the book of Hebrews is going to know. He even believed, even though the concept of resurrection had never even been seen, that he was even like, God could even raise my child from the dead, because he says, this is the son. And so he takes him up, and they set up the altar, and then he binds Isaac, which incidentally took faith on Isaac's part, that he was willing to follow through, and that he was willing to be there. And so Isaac allows himself to be tied up, and he lays him down, and he goes and he gets the knife. It's a sacrifice. He's going to put the knife down on the throat. And so he's sitting there, and he's wondering, okay, God, where are you going to show up? What are you going to do? And just as he's getting ready to go, God cries out and says, stop, Abraham, stop. Their cry rings out for him to stop, and God intervenes at this moment. And as we see in Genesis 22:12, he tells Abraham, he goes, now I know that you fear God, because you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me. Abraham, you were willing to go through this. And God goes on to cite the Abrahamic covenant and cite the things that He's going to do in 22 verses 15 to 18, stating that, guess what, Abraham? Because of your faithfulness, again, this is that follow through, because you were willing to follow through, the promises of land, seed, and blessing will now be fulfilled. And thus, it illustrates that Abraham's obedience was vital to the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. And we see the faith that it took on his part to do this. Incidentally, in 22:23, it's just, you get kind of this little genealogy at the end of chapter 22. And we look at that and we're like, oh, it's kind of a random genealogy. But if you look, there's one little nugget there in 22:23 where it mentions that Rebekah emerges. Now, we know that Rebekah later will become the wife of Isaac. And so just the mentioning of Rebekah shows that God is at work to fulfill the promise to the next generation. So even while this is going on over here, God is at work behind the scenes to fulfill His promise. Already working to provide a wife for Isaac, because you can't have any seed, you can't have any children unless you have a wife. And God is already at work to make that happen. Other hints of fulfillment we see in regards to land. That Abraham buys a cave to bury Sarah. And he buys not just a cave, but a field at Machpelah. And so this is the first fulfillment of the promise of land. Incidentally, whenever he goes to do that, they're like, hey, the village elders are respectful. They're like, just take a cave. You don't need this. We respect you. Bury your wife in there. But Abraham is adamant. No, I need land. I want to pay you. And so they negotiate out a land price. And so this little sliver of land, this cave, and this little piece in this field become the first fulfillment of that promise. Because now Abraham has land. And it's going to grow, but he has a spot. Incidentally, there's something also neat in the text. It's, again, something very small, but it says that Sarah died in the land. Sarah died in Canaan. She didn't die at home. She died in the land. And that's very important to drive across, is that because within that, we see that she was willing to go on a journey, and that meant the sacrifice of home. And so that's exactly what happened. So we see that too, where God might be calling you. You've already maybe left some things behind. And we see that as a Christian, as we walk with God, He's going to call us to leave things behind. It might be to leave the place where you grew up, literally in that case. And you might, just in the case of Sarah, die in that land. We see also the fulfillment of seed, where God guides Abraham's servant to provide a wife who will be Rebekah for Isaac in Genesis 24. So again, all the while, God is working behind the scenes. So for Abraham to see that his son gets married to Rebekah. And incidentally, Abraham's going to live long enough to see Rebekah bring forth children with Esau and Jacob. Now this marriage will lead to the birth of Jacob and Esau, and Abraham will have 6 more sons. By the way, after the death of Sarah, he's going to marry a woman named Keturah, and he's going to have 6 more sons through that marriage after Sarah's death. And incidentally, one of those is going to be Midian. He's going to be the father of the Midianites. Who does Moses marry? He marries Zipporah. She's a Midianite. So again, it's one of these interesting things where God is not done with Abraham. So Abraham in total has 8 sons. So this idea of like, we're starting to see all those, again, stars in the sky, we're starting to see a fulfillment of that. And so too, we see the fulfillment of blessing because Abraham and his descendants are wealthy. Note this verse. It says, when Isaac planted in that land, so he's in Canaan, he planted in it, he reaped in the same year 100 times what he had sown because the Lord had blessed him. Literally, the man became wealthy. He became very prominent. That's the way it quotes it. It's saying, there's a lot of times in the Hebrew text you get redundancies. He became wealthy. He became prominent. And the narrator is doing that because it's wanting to really draw your attention there in 12 to 13, that there is something happening. Isaac is being blessed. Abraham is being blessed. And you're going to see this happen later with Jacob and subsequently his sons. So that's what's happening. We've already had the promise with Abraham, the fulfillment with Isaac, and now we're going to talk about Rebekah and then going on with Jacob and Esau. But in the meantime, there's some other things going on. But I thought it's important to make a note here about Lot. Because Lot, Abraham's nephew, if you recall back in chapter 12, he comes along with Abram and Sarai at the time, and they end up having a split because they just had too many sheep. I mean, again, this blessing, and so they split the flocks, and so Lot decides to live near Sodom. He sees this land as beautiful, and that's the land he wants. And so he lives near Sodom, and this becomes the beginning of multiple compromises on Lot's part. So he lives near Sodom, and then as we begin to see in the text, he moves into Sodom. Why? Because when Sodom is taken over, in Genesis 14, he's taken with it. Well, hold on, how did he get captured? Oh, he was living in Sodom. And then when we get to chapter 18, 19, we realize that in Sodom, he rises to a position of authority. He's standing at the city gates. Incidentally, when you read the Old Testament, it says that someone was standing in the city gates. That was a way to communicate that they were in a place of authority because your judges and city officials would be right there in the city gates. So he's now not just another schmo, just another regular guy living in Sodom. He's crawled the ladder. Incidentally, this position of authority will later lead to calls of hypocrisy, which I'll get to here in just a little bit. And so God ends up deciding to judge Sodom and Gomorrah because their evil had gotten so bad. It had become so horrible. So there's Lot lying in there, and Abraham knows he's in there. And so Abraham pleads, and we see this in chapter 18. He pleads that God will save the city. And he starts, incidentally, at 50. God's like, yeah, I'll save it at 50. And then he's like, well, what about? And then Abraham kind of, he starts to parlay. Well, what about if there's only 45? Would you save it if it's 45? God, yes, I'll save 40. Okay. What about 40? So it's almost like we've got this bartering going on. And he whittles God all the way down to 10. And God goes, if there's 10 righteous people, I'm not going to judge. And so incidentally, scholars have wrestled over, why did he stop there? Couldn't he have gone maybe down to 5? And we ultimately don't know. And we kind of, again, this is an assumption we have to make. Abraham probably thought, surely there's got to be 10 people in that city who follow Yahweh. But it's clear they weren't because the city was judged. And so these messengers, these 2 angels go down, and they go down to the city to investigate and see what's going on. And while in that city, you may recall, Lot meets them at the city gate, and Lot, using ancient Near Eastern custom, again, he invites them into his home, and while in his home, they're threatened with gang rape. And so as a result, Lot has to intervene. Lot goes outside and says, wait, guys, wait, you can't do this. This is just wrong. And they're like, no, 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 we want to have sex with these men. And so this shows us again that the city's just how bad things have gotten. Incidentally, that's not the only reason that God judged Sodom. They're inhospitable. The fact that they are not caring of their guests. This is also going to be mentioned later in the prophetical literature of the Old Testament. The fact is that Sodom and Gomorrah had sins of multiple levels. It wasn't just one sin. It wasn't just this homosexual rape. And by the way, some of you are like, yeah, but then Lot shoves his daughters outside and says, here, take my virgin daughters. How good a solution is that? Well, again, it's important to understand context, because in the ancient Near East, when you welcome someone into your home, they were under your protection. You had to take care of them at all costs. And while, again, we look at this and we're like, this is horrible. How could someone do this? In other words, offer up their daughters. Lot was following through with custom. In reality, though, he should have put himself out there and made himself available. He shouldn't even made his daughters an option. But two things. One, first of all, as he does, it becomes clear they're not interested in Lot. They're not interested in his daughters. They want these guys. And also, this shows us how bad the folks in Sodom were. They were focused on these two men. So I don't think no matter what it was, it would have stopped it. And so despite all of this, Lot's intervention, the angels have to intervene, and so they blind the people. And not only do they blind them, these guys wear themselves out trying to find the door. I mean, again, it just shows you how deep the sinful desires run, that even though they're blind, they're trying to discern the door and figure out where it is. And so as a result, the angels sit there and say, hey, bud, it's time to get out of town. And so Lot goes to his son-in-laws, the guys who were going to marry his daughters, and he tells them. And they laugh at him. They're like, ain't going to happen. And then as they go to leave, incidentally, the angels have to literally pull Lot and his wife and his daughters out of the city because they didn't want to leave. And we see, too, that the wife didn't heed the warning of judgment. In other words, don't look back. And she looks back and turns into a pillar of salt. And so again, we see that Lot begins to lose. He lost his home. He's lost his position within that home. He's lost his son-in-laws. He's lost his wife. And though he and his daughters escape, they pay a high cost for their time in Sodom. Because his daughters look around, they realize, as they're in this cave, there's no men. What are we going to do? How are we going to have children? And so they get Lot drunk. I mean, that's messed up. But why even do you think that enters their mind? When you grow up in Sodom, you see all kinds of stuff. And so as a result, not only does it happen a lot once, it happens twice. That he is drunk, and his daughters get him drunk, and they sleep with him. And as a result, the Ammonites and the Moabites come about. And so we see that these two nations that will later be a thorn in Israel's side come about through Lot's drunken incestual sex. It's unfortunate. So Lot has not just lost his home, his career, his son-in-laws, his potential son-in-laws, his wife. And if you think about it too, now he's got this. And so it becomes this this warning of like, what happens when we make compromises? What places can we get into? Incidentally, 2 Peter is going to call Lot a righteous man. And you very likely, again, based upon that, he's in the kingdom of God. But it becomes an evidence of what happens when we begin to go down these roads. But we see again that God's love for Lot, and that he pulled him out of Sodom. He didn't want him to die in there. He got him out. But as a result of this, as you become more and more familiar, the Ammonites and the Moabites are going to be a real problem for Israel. Now, we're going to transition back, though, to Abraham. And we're going to talk about this sibling rivalry. Because Isaac is going to marry Rebekah. And after a time, they can't get pregnant for a long time. It takes about 20, he gets married in his 40s to Rebekah. And 20 years later, they're still without children. And so Isaac pleads to God to have a child. And so God allows Rebekah to get pregnant. And within this pregnancy, she now realizes she's got her womb, things are happening. She goes, what's the deal? And she goes to God, and God tells her, there are 2 children in your womb. And they're struggling. And you know what? This is a feature, because there's 2 nations within your womb. And the older will serve the younger. And it's already God, through this oracle, making clear that the younger child is the one that I'm going to send the blessing through. Incidentally, in the Hebrew, whenever you look at it, one translation puts it this way, that Rebekah's like, if this is what being pregnant is like, I don't want to be pregnant. Because evidently there was such a tussle going on within her womb. And then when they're born, yes, Esau comes out first, but Jacob, Esau being hairy because he was a furry guy, and then Jacob comes out second, and he's grasping on to Esau's heel, which again, Jacob's name is a word play on the word heel catcher, one that grabs the heel. But as they grow up, it becomes apparent that Isaac wants to do things his way. And Isaac's passions, his passion for wild game, he loves the wild game of the field, and who hunts it? Esau does. His passions lead him to favor Esau. And now Rebekah, though, she favors Jacob. It says he's a man of the tents, okay? And so he's a calm man. And so even we have this house divided, Rebekah with Jacob, Isaac with Esau. And so it comes time now for Isaac, because he's getting old, and he says, it's time to pass on the blessing, and his eyesight has failed him. And he tells Esau, I want you to go, and I want you to go make the dish that I love. Go kill the deer, bring it back to me, make the dish that I love, and I'm going to bless you. And as you recall, Rebekah overhears this. And incidentally, we always talk about how Jacob's deception, it's Rebekah's plan. She's the mastermind. She overhears this. She goes and gets Jacob. And she says, you're going to go and you're going to go sacrifice, you're going to go cut up this goat, and we're going to make the meal, and you're going to get get your brother's clothes, and you're going to wear those. And hey, your brother's really furry, he's really hairy, and so we're going to take these goat skins and we're going to use those, we're going to put those on your neck and on your forearms, and you are going to get this blessing because you're the one that's supposed to get it. It's all Rebekah. It's her at work trying to secure the blessing. Incidentally, Jacob protests. He's like, well, what happens if Dad finds out? He fears a curse if by fooling his father. And we see that it's Rebekah. She basically says, listen to me. Do as I say. And so we see that Jacob is actually the one that hesitates. It's Rebekah that's pushing him on. And so within this, he gets all ready. He does it. And he goes in. And we see that Isaac, not only, again, his eyes are blinded. They're weakened. And so the sense of sight isn't there like it is before. But we see that Isaac's other senses fail him. And so Isaac ends up blessing Jacob. And it's at this point, by the way, in the text, a couple things I want to point out. Everyone at this point thinks they've won. Isaac thinks, if we've got a play going on, it'd be fascinating. You see it on the stage. Isaac thinks, I've prevailed. I have now blessed Esau, who I wanted to be. Esau's out and he's hunting. He goes, yes, I'm going to get this blessing. Rebekah thinks, we've pulled it off. Yes, we have won. Her and Jacob, both, we have won. Everyone thinks they've won, but there is going to be an aftermath, which we're going to get to. But another note to hit on. God's name is not mentioned in that entire chapter. Not once. Now, it doesn't mean that God isn't at work, because I believe He is. But again, the narrator, by not mentioning God in the entire chapter, is trying to show you of like, this is what happens. This is what happens when people try to do things their own way. You know, well, hold on. What would have happened if Rebekah wouldn't have intervened? I don't know. God would have taken care of it somehow. I don't know. But again, because Rebekah's intervention is going to bring about an aftermath, which is what we're going to talk about now. As a result of Jacob getting the blessing, Esau has a desire to kill Jacob. He's like, okay, my dad's going to die soon, and when he dies, I'm going to take that joker out. And Rebekah learns of this, and she goes to Isaac and says, hey, we need to get Jacob to get a wife. Incidentally, Esau had 2 wives at the time, but they were wives of Hittite wives. They were Canaanites. And we learned previously that in previous chapters that they drew disgust, an annoyance, a sense of embarrassment for Isaac and Rebekah. And so Rebekah, think about it too, she uses that, because if she goes to Isaac and says, hey, I think Esau is going to kill Jacob. I think Isaac would have done, he's not going to do that. That's not going to happen. But Rebekah realizes, no, this is going to happen. And so how does she can't do that, so she's got to leverage it. And she goes, hey, you know how we just disapprove of Esau's wives? We can't have Jacob do this. Send Jacob to my homeland. Let's send him to my brother. Let him find a wife there. And so Isaac says, yep, you're right. And so they're going to send Jacob off, not only to find a wife, but to save his life. Incidentally, this will be the last time, whenever Jacob goes off, this will be the last time Rebekah sees Jacob alive, because he isn't going to live again. And so within that too, we see that as Esau remains, he has those two wives. Jacob is going off. He's going to get his new wife. And though her scheme wins Jacob the blessing, Rebekah's going to lose it. She'll never see Jacob alive again. And again, ultimately, Isaac's palate, his desire for this wild game, this tasty stew, has brought about the destruction of his family. Because now we have one brother who wants to kill the other, and as a result, Jacob's got to go off, and the family will be disintegrated. But God is still at work to keep his covenantal promise intact. In fact, whenever Jacob goes off, God is going to confirm his covenantal promise to Jacob at Bethel, because that's where Jacob's going to see the angels coming up and down from the heavens. And he appears to Jacob and he tells Jacob, I'm going to protect you and I'm going to bring you back to your homeland. And this is really Jacob's first exposure to Yahweh, and it's the beginning of Jacob's journey with God. Also, another thing to note, Bethel, it's the Hebrew word for Beit, which means house, and El being God, or the strong one. Okay, so the house of God. And so that's what Jacob names it, is because this is when he first, God first appeared to him. And so this is one of those important sites within Israelite history, is Bethel. Beit El, the house of God. Now within that too, I think it's important to show real quick about Esau, a lesson in poor choices. Because Esau claims to be starving. Okay, you might remember, and he's at the point of death, and so he sells his birthright to Jacob for a pot of red stuff. Give me that red stuff. Give me that red stuff. And so he gives away a fortune for temporary gain. His giving away of a fortune for temporary gain illustrates Esau's short-sighted thinking. I mean, I know you're hungry, but he traded off the birthright for a pot of soup. And it shows that he's ruled by his passions. We also see that Esau marries not only one Canaanite, but two. And so this causes great anxiety for his parents, as shown by Genesis 26, verse 35. And so it shows he doesn't value whom he married so much as his grandfather Abraham did for Isaac. And it's only when the blessing is clearly lost that Esau understands its true value. In 27:34, we see there's a bitter wailing on his behalf. And it attests to this because it becomes a picture of what those who forsake God's blessing look like. And see, that's why the author of the book of Hebrews is going to use him in Hebrews chapter 12 to say, don't be like Esau. And so again, while they thought Jacob was just going to go off for a little while, we see that it's a 20-year delay. And so Jacob goes to Laban's household with the expectation of being there just a short time. And yet, he's there 7 years for Rachel. He sees Rachel, that's who I want to marry. And he says, you know what? Laban says, name your wages. And he says, 7 years. I'll work for it. Okay, sure. But it turns out to be Leah. Because why? There's deception on the wedding night, and Laban swaps Leah for Rachel. And incidentally, it's the same verbiage that's used of Jacob's deception of Esau. So again, we see a little bit of he's reaping what he's sown at this point. And Jacob had like a high school equivalency exam, in deception. Laban's got like a double doctorate. And so he's going to get taken to school. And that's exactly what happens. Because whenever he says to Laban, you've cheated me, Laban's like, well, it's not our custom to give the firstborn, the second before the firstborn in my country. And Jacob's like, well, no. And you didn't tell me that. Laban, well, you didn't ask. And so he has to work another 7 years to gain Rachel. Now, he gained her after the bridal week. He says, complete your bridal week with Leah, and then you can get Rachel. But you owe me another 7 years. And so now it's turned just to be there just a short time has turned into now 14 years. And then he spends another 6 years raising Laban's sheep, which incidentally he was doing the whole time. But he's already got his wives. And it's during that time that God will end up providing for him, because by the time he leaves, he's going to have large amounts of sheep, which is what I get to here. It says that by the time Jacob leaves, 20 years later, he's a different man. But this time he's got 2 wives. He's got 12 sons. By the way, God's coming through. 12 sons. Incidentally, we know he has one daughter, Dinah. Could have had more, but he has 12 sons and heaps of sheep. Okay, so again, in New Zealand, heaps is a way to say large amounts. And New Zealand is the land of sheep. So I thought, hey, why not throw on there's heaps of sheep. So he leaves with all these sheep. And incidentally, I think it's important to list out. So Leah gives him Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and Issachar, and Zebulun. And incidentally, those names mean different things. You should go and look those up. There's a story to the names. Because Leah thought, incidentally, through her sons that she would gain Jacob's love. But she never does. Jacob always prefers Rachel. That was the one who he wanted all along. Rachel is going to be the mother of Joseph and Benjamin, who are going to be his 2 most favorite sons. Zilpah is maidservant, and she's going to bring forth Gad and Asher. And Bilhah is Rachel's maidservant, and she's going to bring forth Dan and Naphtali. It's baby wars. It's like Jacob's just sitting there and he just shows up in the tent because the women are fighting for his affection through children. And as we look at this, we're like, this is the first family of Israel? This is horrible. It's messed up. But it's through this again, through this brokenness, that God does great things. Again, that Genesis 50 verse 20, that our evil intentions can lead to good. Now it's important real quick to do a quick exercise on polygamy. And one of those things is that polygamy was quite common in the ancient Near East. So polygamy is the idea of more than one spouse, whereas this might be a new term for you, polygyny means more than one wife. So Jacob was practicing polygyny by having more than one wife. And it was very common in the ancient Near East. But as we begin to see in the text, it was a form of social security for women, especially for those who had lost husbands or who did not have one. It was also important for nomadic or closed farming communities where the number of women was greater than men. And so polygyny was a viable and legitimate option. It also, again, functioned like as a social security for women. And there are, in fact, are Old Testament case laws that make provision for it. Not because God approves of it, I would argue, but because God is slowly redeeming a culture ethically. And I think it's important to underscore that the stories of the Old Testament do not hide the complexity and the pain that comes about through polygyny. And so this could imply God's negative view of these relationships. Again, as we look, that anytime there's polygamous relationships, there's tension within the family. And so while we can't say this is what's going on, or definitively this is what is going on, it could imply that God has a negative view of these relationships. But again, He made allowance for it. And ultimately, again, this is Deuteronomy 29:29, where God says, I have my ways and you have to trust the way that I'm doing things. Another excursus here, this one's on primogeniture, or the idea of firstborn. Because primogeniture was the modus operandi, or the MO of the ancient Near East, where the firstborn son received the whole inheritance. Because again, that's the way it happened. But as you see throughout the text, Genesis turns this practice on its head, because God chooses to elevate the younger over the older. Isaac, not Ishmael. Jacob, not Esau. Judah, not Reuben. Ephraim, not Manasseh. And so as with other cultural customs, God displays that His ways may not always correspond to man's ways. And so within that, before Jacob can leave, as Jacob goes to leave, he has to face his past. And so Jacob wrestles with God before facing Esau. And so he fears, so he sends his children and his wives ahead of him. And there's still much that's not understood about this story, but it becomes clear that Jacob is wrestling with a divine being, because when this individual he's wrestling with touches his hip, it's disjointed at the touch. I don't know about you, but that clues you in. You're wrestling someone who might not be human. And so Jacob's desire to know the name of this deity, incidentally, because he says, tell me your name. It points to an ancient belief that knowing the name of the supernatural being could be used for manipulation or power. In other words, if I know this deity's name, then I can manipulate it and use it to get what I want. And so before he must face the future, he must face the past. And that is why, while during the course of this wrestling, God renames him. And his name, Jacob's name, is now Israel. God fights. And it's the idea, but before it must happen, Jacob must confess his name, which again is a word play on the word for heel tripper. So again, God, you need to confess who you are, because again, Jacob has used deceit in his past. But God is now like, no, God fights. I will fight for you. And Israel's survival points to the success that God will give him. But next, Jacob faces Esau, and instead of finding condemnation, he finds forgiveness. And so what's clear is it looks like Jacob is not the only one who's been sanctified over these years. And so we see a bringing together of the brotherhood. But yet there's familial conflict within the family of Jacob. We see that Reuben foolishly has sex with Jacob's concubine, Bilhah, in Genesis 35:22. And though Jacob doesn't say anything at the time, this will cost him the blessing of the firstborn later on. And within that, as you're going to see in Genesis 49, 3-4. Incidentally, Jacob has a daughter named Dinah. He could have had others, but but we learn about Dinah because she's mentioned in chapter 34. She's important to the story. It doesn't mean that Jacob's other daughters weren't important as well. They just weren't part of the story. So again, this is part of speculation of how things work. But in this deal, Jacob appears ambivalent about her being raped, since, again, she was a child through Leah. And so her brothers, Simeon and Levi, intervene through a brutal massacre. You'll see it whenever you read the chapter. And so this will cost them the potential blessing of the firstborn that Reuben forfeited through his action. So now that leaves us to son number 4, which is Judah, who will later end up with that. So Jacob also, his elevation of Joseph, combined with Joseph's dreams, hey, everybody's going to bow down and worship me, is going to bring about resentment from his brother. And so as a result, they're going to look to take him out. And so this son of Rachel is loved more than any other son. And so subsequently, he was sold into slavery by his brothers. And so we see again, as we're coming to the conclusion of Genesis, that the Lord was with Joseph. And so he avoids death by being sold as a slave. That's what they wanted to do. But Judah sits there and says, no, let's sell him as a slave. And so that's what happens. He's bought by Potiphar in Egypt, who's the captain of the guard for Pharaoh, and he rises to prominence in his home. Yet, he's falsely accused of rape by Potiphar's wife, and as a result is thrown into the king's jail, where there he rises in stature again. Again, we see that Potiphar's wife desires him greatly, but he takes the high road. He won't do it. He says, your husband has given me everything except you, and I cannot take it. But that false accusation leads him to being thrown in jail. And while in jail, again, you may be familiar, he interprets the dreams for Pharaoh's cupbearer and his baker, and yet his accuracy is forgotten. Joseph was like, all right, gonna get out. Predicted those dreams. Yeah, I'm gonna be getting out soon. And then a couple days go by, and then a week, and then a month, and then 2 months, and then 6. And I guarantee you, Joseph was like, I've been forgotten. And we know that it was 2 years after predicting those dreams that he remained in prison. We don't know how long, incidentally, he was in prison before. But that's not a place you want to be. But, again, God was at work at the right time. Because when Pharaoh's dreams couldn't be interpreted, everyone sits there and they're like, well, we don't know what to do. And that's when the cupbearer goes, oh, I'm a jerk. Yeah, you're not going to believe this. Remember when you sent me to jail? There was a guy in there. And he interpreted my dream, and I'm here, and he interpreted the baker's dream, and he's dead. What he said happened. You need to talk to that guy. And so Joseph goes from prison to being in the Pharaoh's presence, from the outhouse to the penthouse. And it's from that Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and he's made second in command of Egypt by Pharaoh. Incidentally, note the boldness of Joseph, where he sits here and goes, if I was Pharaoh, I would do this and this. I mean, what has he got to lose? And so Pharaoh puts him in command. And as a result, Joseph prospers once again. Through his wisdom, Egypt is going to thrive. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Judah is metamorphosizing. He's changing. And we see that he's a man of low character. It was his ideal to sell Joseph into slavery. But he does not give his daughter-in-law, Tamar, what she required by withholding his youngest son, Shelah, from her. Again, he has 3 sons. First son's married to Tamar. We see that he's evil. He gets killed. Second son goes in, and he has to basically provide an heir for Tamar. This is through the process of levirate marriage, which again was socially acceptable. And so he's to have sex with Tamar and provide an heir for her. But he pulls out, and he gets sexual pleasure, and Tamar doesn't get what she needs. And so as a result, and this happens multiple times, as you see in the text, and God kills him to where all that's left is Shelah. And so as a result, Judah's like, oh, no. And so he refuses, says, oh, I'll give him to you when he's older. But it becomes apparent that that's not going to happen. And so what does Tamar do? She disguises herself as a prostitute, and so that she can have sex with Judah. And we see within this, what does it say about Judah's character? That she would realize this is the way to get to him. So this is, again, not a man of high character. And so within that, it turns out that she does get pregnant. But before she does it, for that deal, she says, hey, what about payment? And she takes his staff and his cord and his seal. In the ancient Near East, that's your driver's license and your credit card and all major forms of identity. Now, I don't know about you, but a lot of people wouldn't give that up to have sex with a prostitute. Didn't seem to hold back Judah. So when it came revealed later that Tamar was pregnant, and Judah says, she has been sleeping around, she has practiced infidelity. We need to burn her. That's what he says. She says, oh, hold on. Before you do that, can you tell me who these belong to? And we see that Judah shows amazing repentance. He realizes, oh my goodness, I'm the father. And when he is confronted by Tamar's proof, he shows extreme repentance, and that he is the one who impregnated her. And so subsequently in Genesis 38:56, he says, she is more righteous than I. Tamar, incidentally, he will never have sex with her again. She will give birth to twin sons. One of those sons is Perez, who's in the messianic line of Jesus. Look in Matthew chapter 1, and you'll see it. So again, this reminds us again, what you intended for evil, God used for good. And this incident will break him, because he becomes later, whenever they go to Egypt to buy food during the famine, he's willing to stay behind in Egypt so that his brother Benjamin may be freed from jail. He goes, they don't realize it's Joseph they're dealing with, and he says, look, if Benjamin stays here, it's going to break my father's heart. Put me in jail. And that shows Joseph that his brothers are a changed people. And so this leads to again, we're getting near the end here, the family reunion. The famine is so severe that Jacob sends his sons to Egypt to buy food. And while they interact with Joseph, Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And so Joseph decides to test them and see, what kind of folks are you? And he does. And we see that again, as this interaction happens, that Joseph's brothers, through these 2 situations, pass the test. And that Judah's leadership moves Joseph to break down and reveal who he actually is. And so the brothers now must return and tell Jacob, think about this, you got to go home and tell Dad that I'm still alive and that I'm not dead. So that means you got to tell your dad, actually, we sold our brother into slavery. He wasn't killed we made that all up, that he was killed by a wild animal. And so that's telling them the truth. I mean, think about it. That's a major test. They could have gone home and never came back. But by doing so, by telling the truth, they allow the family to return to Egypt, where they will reside, and they will also raise their sheep and their family there. Incidentally, the Egyptians despise sheep, as we see in Genesis 46:34. And so as a result, Joseph provides a way for his family to live in nearby Goshen, raising Pharaoh's herds. And his wise administration will save his family and the Egyptians from starvation. And so finally, before passing away, Jacob is going to continue the promise, and he blesses each of his sons. And it's the first time we see Jacob acknowledge Reuben's misdeed. Judah is given the strongest blessing because he's told that the scepter will not depart from him. And incidentally, this is why David and subsequently Jesus, those Davidic and Messianic lines have to come through Judah. And Jacob also, his death makes Joseph's brothers fearful of Joseph's potential reprisal. Because they're like, oh, okay, you were just nice because Dad was alive. But Joseph looks at his brothers in 50:20 again and says, what were you thinking? Why would I do that now? What you intended for evil, God used for good. And so, again, reminding his brothers that God is at work and God has been taking care of us. He's holding true to the promises that he made to our forefathers. And this wraps up the book of Genesis. And this wraps up the patriarchal era. And so, again, as we transition now, the Israelites are in Egypt, and this is where they will remain until God decides that it's time to pull them out through the Exodus. And that will be the topic of our third lecture. I'll see you then.